Welcome to the Stress, Trauma, and Resilience Seminar. Today we are fortunate to have Vula Baliotis present on Understanding Gifted Children, Common Characteristics, and Treatment Considerations. Dr. Vula Baliotis is a licensed psychologist whose interests and training are in doing deep, life-changing therapeutic work. Her professional and personal experiences have led her to focus on working with gifted, creative, and highly sensitive individuals, including adopted individuals and their families, women, individuals seeking support around identity, and those who are estranged from their families.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. So we're going to be talking about gifted kiddos today. A very interesting bunch. So I want to just start off with the question, what is gifted? Like when you saw the title of the talk and you decided to come, what came up for you? What are your thoughts about what gifted means?
Sometimes I've heard that gifted kids are emotionally not so gifted.
Yep, we're going to learn about that. So gifted in some ways and not so gifted in others.
Somebody that's truly gifted is all the way around in almost every capacity.
Okay.
Those who are truly in the quintessential sense.
I see. So really different ideas about gifted. Right. Anything else? Anybody else have any thoughts about what, or any ideas of what gifted brings up for you as you think about the word?
Initially, I think of just sort of intelligence, like a higher level of intelligence, and with kids, like skipping grades or far outweighing their peers.
Yeah, that's probably the first thing most people think about, is somebody who's smart and possibly has skipped a grade or needs to skip a grade. So what we find, and in my practice, I work a lot with gifted kids, adults, and families, and what I can see is that giftedness is a loaded word. Let me tell you what it isn't. It's not about being a special child. Every child, every human being is special, and it's not really related to one's worth as a human being. And sometimes I want to bring that up because a lot of times that is a kind of a bias with that word is, well, what makes this child so much more special? Every child is special. So that's not what it's about. And also, not only is it a loaded word, but there's disagreement in the field as to what the term gifted even refers to and what areas of giftedness does giftedness cover. So let me talk a little bit about the federal definition of gifted and talented. So the federal definition really identifies giftedness as having outstanding abilities and being capable of high performance. Okay, so abilities, but also performance. And then by virtue of this, the federal definition talks about the necessity for differentiated educational programs and or services that are beyond the ones normally provided by the school program, okay? And this is important in order to realize their contribution to self and society, okay? That's the federal definition, but what we find, what I know from the kids that I see, is that a lot of times schools have a hard time implementing that for many reasons, financial and political and all kinds of reasons. And one of the main ones that I hear from parents is that there's sometimes schools have to really focus on the children that are maybe scoring below at the average range, and so there's such a need there that a lot of times these children who also have needs end up being overlooked. There aren't enough funds, or well, they're not really having a problem. What problem can they possibly be having? They're smart, so they're all often overlooked. I think this definition of intelligence is a useful one to think about. So the central mission of intelligence is to solve various problems in their natural and social environments in order to survive, but also to thrive. So when schools say, your child is doing fine, they're not having a major problem, well, children might be surviving, and some of them barely, because some of them, even at an extreme, can become suicidal when they are so bored in school. But there's also this idea of needing to thrive, and that often they don't have the opportunity a lot of times to do that in school settings. Okay, so this means that intelligence is ultimately about the ability to self-discover knowledge and patterns from a world of uncertainties and infinite possibilities. And this is important because sometimes when I give like the WISC, the intelligence or cognitive abilities test, and I go over results with parents, I might hear a comment like, well, they just never learned how to do that task. And to be sure, lots of kids who are smart can, once they learn how to do a task, be able to do it and do it well. But this idea is about self-discovering knowledge. It's about what children kind of figure out as they're going along on the test, and they kind of figure out, oh, this is what the pattern is, or this is what they're kind of asking for on this task. So let's talk a little bit about giftedness and IQ. Let me go back. The average IQ is on a bell curve. We do find that on a test like the WISC, IQ does tend to fall. Scores do tend to fall in a way that makes the shape of a bell curve, and the bulk of people go on the height of the bell curve area. And the average IQ is between 90 and 110, with the middle, 100 being right at 50th percentile, meaning 50% of kids score worse and 50% of kids score better than that child, okay? So the high and low ranges of average are between 25th and 75th percentile, and 68% of the population around is in that range, okay? The majority of the population. Here's where giftedness starts, where it's typically identified. A child is typically identified as gifted. It's at 130. So that's at the 98th percentile, much higher. This is the very superior range, and it's about only 2.2% of the population that is in this range, okay? So just to give you a sense, it's average, then high average, then superior, and then very superior. And then just to compare, the average IQ of people graduating college is about 120. So that's right at the cusp between superior and high average. You don't have to be in the gifted range to be able to be successful. You can be quite successful without, having an IQ of 130 or above. And the average IQ of executives, attorneys, scientists, and physicians is about 125. Okay? Even once we get into the gifted range, there are different classifications, because as you can imagine, there's differences whether somebody's at 130 or in the 150s in their level of intelligence. So this is just a little breakdown of, there's gifted, which is in the very superior range, and then everything above that's also in the very superior range, but we have highly gifted, exceptionally gifted, and then profoundly gifted. So these are children who are above the 99.9 percentile. Very, very bright kids. And giftedness does tend to, or IQ tends to become stable. So across the lifespan, probably like literature shows around age 7 is when it kind of stabilizes. Before that, a lot of exposure might boost up IQ. But then at some point it kind of evens out. So that's about when it seems to stabilize. Common myths. Throw out some myths maybe that you can imagine or that you've heard about giftedness. They don't struggle in school. That's a very common myth, yes. Anything else? Normal attention span. Anything else? Nerd, right? I think I have some of these on here. So we've got show-offs about their abilities. Will become successful adults. They're organized and have good study skills. They're as emotionally as intellectually advanced. think that's what you were talking about. They don't experience difficulties in school. They can't have a learning disability. They're only good at one thing. Or on the other hand, sometimes people think they're good at everything. Typically are valued for their abilities. They're proud and arrogant. They're born that way, so it's all genetic. They're weird nerds. They don't have special education needs, and they don't have to try hard. Okay, so some of the ones that you mentioned. So the question of is it hereditary or environmental? You know, when a child is gifted, and there is a strong hereditary component. Parents of gifted children are often gifted themselves. And siblings often tend to be gifted, but they may not be as, equally gifted, and sometimes they're not. There might be a gifted child and then a child that's not gifted. But genetics is only one part of it. Gifted children really are most likely to do well and to really flourish in a supportive environment. So the environment is really important. So they need to be exposed, they need to have practice and use, and they need opportunity. So right now, as I'm saying this, I'm thinking about children who are underserved, who maybe are in a low socioeconomic status, or maybe are a racial or ethnic minority, and they may not be identified as such, or they may not have the opportunity to be exposed to information. So they don't get that chance really to have that supportive environment sometimes that is also needed to really flourish in their giftedness. So overall, it's an emerging experience that's a combination, of hereditary and then the right environment. So I'm going to start to talk a little bit about the common characteristics, and I've broken them down into cognitive and emotional characteristics, although a lot of times they're so intertwined that it's hard to really separate them. But overall, we can say that gifted children tend to have very strong verbal abilities. They start speaking earlier than other children do. They have unusually large vocabularies at a very young age. I'm thinking about a 5-year-old girl who was playing in my office and pretending she was, there were two moms like walking their babies. And she's like, oh, yes, so much gentrification in this city. She was 5. So you can see the high level of vocabulary. They speak in complex sentences. So sometimes parents will report, my child didn't just say one word, they started speaking in sentences. And they read early and avidly. And they often teach themselves to read. I remember once when I had a parking ticket and the little slip had fallen in the back of my car, and my niece, I don't know, she was 4 maybe, and she said to me, Auntie, why do you have a parking ticket? I thought, oh my gosh. She goes, it says parking ticket right there. She knew how to read, and she just learned it on her own. So this is the strong verbal abilities. Then abstract and applied thinking. They understand abstract concepts. So they can compare and contrast. They really find similarities, differences. We tend to see high scores on the similarities subtest on the cognitive test, which looks more at abstract kind of verbal thinking. They understand the connotations and nuances of words in a very sophisticated way often. They use metacognition, so they can think about their thinking, and they can apply knowledge to work out problems. So it's not just that they know facts, they're really good at applying. So like on the achievement test, for instance, all the applied subtests, they tend to score really high on that. They can use their information to solve complex problems. So another characteristic is complex thinking. They seek cognitive stimulation. They go toward difficult problems. They understand complex connections between systems and structures. They like problems with multiple answers and possibilities and solutions, and they can become bored if tasks are too simple or mundane. And just to give you a sense of how bored they could be, especially with doing rote work in school, Imagine if you went to work and all you were doing was, I don't know, counting rice or something, and you know how to do it and you're just doing it day after day. That's how kids can feel when they're really advanced and then they have to do, a whole page of just, I don't know, simple addition problems. It drives them crazy a lot of times, and then they'll become resistant to it. I'm also thinking, I don't know if anybody has seen the Bill Gates documentary that's out lately, but so much of this cognitive complex thinking description is what he talks about in there and what people talk about with him, that he goes toward the difficult problems. He's trying to solve them rather than just being like, I don't know, it's just too big, it's too overwhelming. He is driven to go toward that kind of complex thinking. Okay, another cognitive characteristic is divergent and synergistic thinking. So they oftentimes are seeking new perspectives, novel ideas, new ways of thinking about things. And they're really strong in divergent, so breaking things apart kind of thinking and thinking about things differently, maybe not just in a linear way, but branching off into different areas. But they're also good then at putting things back together in a synergistic way to create a new way of thinking about something. And as follows, they often question conventional ways of thinking and are seen to really think outside of the box. Intense curiosity and passion. The favorite question is why? I'm seeing a 5-year-old little boy, and between the time I pick him up from my waiting room until we walk into my office, which is a very, very small area, like from here to there, he's already asked me about 6 why questions. Why? Why do I have to press the light? Why do I have to wait? Why this? Why that? Why is there another room? Who's here? How does this work? Lots of why, how kinds of questions. So there's a kind of a restlessness and impulsivity or that, because there's always such a hunger to learn and to understand. They tend to be self-motivated and driven to learn and be challenged, and are passionate, very passionate about their beliefs, ideas. When they're debating or in conversations, they really want somebody to know and understand their perspective. And then because of these kinds of curiosities, some of their questions could end up being quite inappropriate. Like a child might ask, why does that person smell? When they might be near a person who is homeless, let's say. And a lot of times these questions could seem rude, but they're really trying to understand, like, what is going on? Well, I want to understand what is this situation that I need to understand. They're also independent thinkers. Okay, so that often will resist following a direction without first receiving an adequate explanation for it, right? So why? They need an explanation. They tend to be leaders, and a lot of times people are drawn to them. They just naturally tend to kind of command that kind of leadership role. They often will defy rules and authority, again, unless they have a good reason to understand why something, and it has to be a reason that makes good sense to them. Otherwise, it's not going to be good enough. And so, as you can imagine, they can experience power struggles, really, with authority. And a lot of times they can be seen as defiant or oppositional or bossy. And I guess, at some level they can be, but a lot of times it's because they really don't understand, and they really, really hate to be infantilized. So I can't tell you how many times parents will come in and say, my child's seen another therapist in the past and hated it because the therapist talked to them like this. Hi, Mary, how are you doing? And they'll just get an attitude of, smarter than this. They don't want to be talked to like that. So they really can seem sometimes really difficult to work with, but it feels like like an attack to their who they are, really, the truth of who they are. And I've had kids actually describe that to me before, especially a little bit older kids. They're also have broad interests and are multi-talented. So they could be very interested in many things at the same time. They might have to, they can shift from one interest to the next. They're often able to work on multiple things at the same time. So, and sometimes teachers will see that as they're not paying attention. But one of the questions that I ask is, are you able to answer, or are you able to say what the teacher was talking about? And more times than not, they can. It's the same thing when we're in session. They might be fiddling around with something while we're talking, but they're able to just stay with the conversation, and they're hearing everything, taking it all in, but they could be doing something else as well. Here's something really painful for these kids. They have sometimes real difficulty choosing between competing interests and tasks. Sometimes they don't want to go to sleep at night because there's so many things that they want to do. And they have a hard time going to sleep because, well, they didn't get to their reading, or they didn't get to their painting, or to doing their genealogy research, or whatever it might be that they're doing for fun. And there's so many interests that it's really hard for them to choose something and to have to let something else go. And this is something that becomes really hard in adulthood too, like finding a career or having so many passions and really not having enough time. And because of all these interests and talents, they can seem kind of disorganized and scattered. But I do want to also mention other gifted kids can have real tunnel vision. They really might be focused on one thing that they're really, really passionate about and that they become superb experts at. And then because of all these interests, they also can have difficulty completing tasks because they're interested in too many things, and then they need constant novelty. They're also imaginative and creative. So, for instance, they're creative problem solvers, and they have imaginative and fluid kinds of thinking. They don't always, like I said, they don't have to be conventional in their way of thinking, but they can kind of go in and out of how they're trying to solve a problem until they come to an understanding or a solution to it. And these are kids who have vivid visualizations and dreams often. They can create very elaborate stories. There can be a kind of a fluidity between truth and fiction in their stories because they're so imaginative. They may have imaginary friends, imaginary pets, and I mean, they really can visualize, and it becomes sometimes very elaborate connection with these imaginary friends. Sometimes also movies or stories that they read or their dreams can be felt so real that, like they'll describe how vivid the colors were, the sounds were in their dreams. And parents often have to be really careful about what they expose their kids to, because anything sad, like if a parent dies even in a kid's show, I mean, they will be devastated and in tears for hours afterwards, and then sometimes for weeks even. So that's how strong their imagination can be, that it feels real. They also tend to have a sense of humor. So they might really find delight in inventing riddles and puns, in having wordplay. A lot of times they'll tell me these kinds of jokes like, well, why are dinos sore? Get it? It's dinosaurs. They really love that kind of wordplay. And their humor might sometimes seem unusual to others, especially things like that other kids might not quite get at their age. They might think it's a little bit strange, but they really love that humor, and they can be sarcastic. They can have, be witty, all kinds of humor that they can use. And they seek knowledge and understanding. So they're really looking at the bigger questions, to more like existential kinds of questions, not just things like, what are we having for dinner? Or, how do I do this math problem? Which, they have those questions too, but they're really looking at things like, why is the sky blue? At a very young age. I remember my nephew asked me once, he was probably, 4 or 5, And he said, why are there more men than women who are homeless? I mean, that's just not something that, he was observing and he was thinking about it and asking the why questions. Here's another one I heard. Why does God get to be so bossy, but I'm not allowed to? So I thought if God's perfect, then I could, get to do that too, because if God's doing it, I should be able to do it. So think questions like that. Or why would God abandon, people in, like if they're in a war-torn country, if God is all loving or benevolent? So these are the kinds of questions that these kids are struggling with. And if you can imagine, there's only 2.2% of that population. They're probably not around a lot of people who are also thinking about these things, and they hold it in, or kind of have to keep it private or hold it alone. And then also they're not satisfied with superficial answers. So something like, well, that's just how it's done, or because I said so, that's not going to work with these kids. That's going to just drive them crazy. So they need a lot more engagement and, again, not feeling infantilized, but really seeing them at a level that they really need that engagement about those kind of questions, and maybe exploring some possible answers, or at least exploring the question. They really need that. And then there's often intense focus and concentration. They can become all consumed in what they're doing. Like if they're reading a book, it doesn't matter what's going on around them. If they're into that book, they're just, come to dinner, brush your teeth, it's time for bed. It doesn't matter. Like it's this, I have to read this and I don't care about anything else. Intense focus. They also notice details that others miss. Like they might notice in my office if a basket is turned a little bit, or if they'll immediately notice a new toy in my office, and if something maybe got a scratch on it, those kinds of things, they just notice those kinds of things. And their focus can last a long time. And they often say, or their parents will say, I can't switch off my thinking. My child won't stop. Like they're always going. So parents are exhausted. These kids are intent. There's constant questions and constant wanting to be thinking about things and grappling with these existential questions, and it can be quite exhausting for parents. And there's interest in experimenting. So they like to take things apart, figure out how they're made, put them back together, reverse how they're putting it back together to see, does something happen differently when I do that? Or they'll like to mix things and taste them, or see what color they make. They really like to experiment. So use their hands in what they're doing. And of course, we've probably heard about perfectionism with gifted kids. They do tend to have very high self-expectations and standards. Even if their parents are not, expecting as much of them, they expect it of themselves. They really have a low tolerance for mediocrity, little room for mistakes, failures, or inadequacies. I've had so many kids who hit themselves or say, I hate myself, when they just make the smallest little mistake. I'm terrible, I should be punished. They expect themselves to already know. So there's no room for learning a lot of times. It's like they have to go from 0 to, I already know, rather than allowing for the process of not knowing and learning. They could be self-critical, feel inadequate, like an imposter or a fraud. So if they don't know something, then all the things that they know, it's like, that's all not real. This is the truth of who I am. And they don't really want to be found out for it. And at the same time, they have difficulty taking credit for their accomplishments, because they could always be better. And they can become also, the way that they are with themselves, they can be that way with other people too. So if anybody falls short, mostly their parents, but their friends too, it can be very disappointing to them. So how they treat themselves is often how they end up being with other people as well. And so here it is, the tyranny of the superior one. It's like both of these are parts of the child, the child's internal world. And so there's a superior one that's saying, you should already know, you should already be perfect at this. And then the other one's saying, but I don't know it yet, I've got to learn. So there's often this battle that's going on the inside. And then as follows, there's often underachievement. So there's this high standard, and they're more aware of what's possible to achieve than their peers often are. And then because they have to learn, they don't already know everything, but they're aware that they don't know everything, they could feel beaten down before they even try to do it. And they may feel unable to meet others' expectations or their own expectations, even if they're projections. So even if the other person's not expecting that of them, they can assume that the other person is because they expect it of themselves. So, well, everybody must expect it of them. And then they can have low self-esteem from that and just like give up and say, well, I'm just going to not even try. I'm not even going to really try to, because the perfect ideal is up here and I know I can't get it, so I might as well just give up. And then we see underachievement. So, here's an example. So their cognitive ability might be here, their self-expectations might be a little higher than their cognitive ability, but their performance is down here because, not because they aren't bright, but because it can't be perfect, so I might as well just give up. So I want to move into the emotional characteristics now, and we'll start with intensity. These kiddos have so much intensity in them, like sometimes it feels like it's just going to burst out of them, that they're just going to explode with intensity. They're very passionate about their feelings and their beliefs, and they can be at all ends of the spectrum. So usually when kids are intense in one area, like, oh, this is the worst thing, I didn't get the correct flavor of my popsicle, at the same time, they could be elated at the other end, be at one with the universe and everything is wonderful and the very best. And those could flip-flop pretty severely and sometimes pretty quickly too. And the stronger emotions, they can lead to depression. Instead of just sadness, they could get depressed, or instead of just being upset with something, there could be an outburst, like on the floor, flailing, screaming, just that if things are felt that intensely. And sometimes about things that to the outsider don't really seem like that big of a deal, like maybe the wrong, flavor of a popsicle, right? I mean, it could be upsetting, it could be disappointing, but it's not, for most people, like the end of the world, but it can feel that way. So intensity can be externalized, like in temper tantrums, or it could be internalized, like more what we think about, like depressive symptoms or beating up on oneself. And their intensities, like I said, can overwhelm them. It's not always convenient or easy to feel so intense for themselves and then also for others around them. Like think about a parent who's trying to get 3 kids to school in the morning, and this is going on every morning. That's really difficult. So it can be overwhelming and extremely inconvenient. And then they're smart enough to then, observe their behavior, even though they might not be able to do anything about it, but then they feel bad about it afterwards, and can feel a tremendous amount of shame. Some more emotional characteristics. These kiddos are extremely sensitive. They're highly emotional and reactive. They're also acutely aware of the differences between themselves and others, and then feel bad about it a lot of times. They're more aware of adult conversations than typical kids, so they're aware of things like, very aware from a young age, even about things like climate change, wars, just serious things that are illnesses, things that are going on that maybe sometimes they'll just pick up on that other people are talking about, or maybe like in a commercial about news, even if they're not watching the whole news program, they're picking up on this stuff and very sensitive. And their sensitivity also is not just emotional, but it's also sensory a lot of times. So they're very aware of the sensual aspects of their environment too. And sometimes they can be very sensory seeking, like they're wanting more and more of that, like touch or taste or smell or whatever it might be. And sometimes they're sensory avoiding. So it like already feels like too much. Their system is already too sensitive to the sensory stimulation. So they need to kind of back off from, or like have an environment where there aren't so many smells or too many visual distractions, things like that. They're also sensitive to other people's feelings, and they pick up on the feeling tone of a situation a lot. Those words are actually from a gifted kid, who uses words, the feeling tone of something. They experience a strong identification with other people because they're sensitive to other people too, and develop very deep attachments to certain people that they connect with, and they really need authenticity in their relationships. So they can hurt easily because they're so sensitive, right? They can hurt easily. They can feel pain and conflict very deeply. And if there's a rift or even a small conflict between them and someone they care about, sometimes it could just feel so intense and so deep that it just breaks their heart. I remember once a child I saw, I bring my dog with me to my office, and she became very protective of my dog, who sometimes licked because of allergies, and she was very protective. And I said to her, I could see you really love animals. And she said to me, "Oh, don't even tell me if anything bad happened to an animal. Don't even tell me." And I said, "It looks like it would break your heart." Yes, it does. It does. A very young little girl talking like this, so very much telling us about her sensitivities. And because of the sensitivities, there can be a lot of angst and then difficulty self-regulating. There can be a sense of alienation, loneliness, great shame, right? If there's an explosion or a tantrum, a lot of times we think about how inappropriate it is, but we forget that that actually feels so bad to the child, herself or himself, and then afterwards there can be a tremendous amount of shame. If I could do all this, why can't I take care of that? Why can't I handle myself? Another characteristic is perceptiveness. Okay, so they can pick up on the complexity of personalities and social dynamics. Sometimes I'll have kids and they'll come in and say, okay, this is how it works at my school. There's the group that this and the group that, and they don't like them because of, and they'll lay out a very rich social dynamic for me that they've already picked up on from day 2 in the new school year. They can simultaneously consider multiple aspects and layers of situations. So, well, there's this, but there's also this. And then if I think about it, there's this. I see somebody who cannot finish a sentence because any sentence, no matter where it starts, will branch out into another perspective and another perspective. And then sometimes about 10 minutes later, this child will say, oh boy, where did I start again? And I'll have to remind them where they started because they've gone to all these different layers in what they're saying. And then they're highly responsive to others' needs and expectations. And sometimes, because they're picking up on this, it happens a lot like with their parents, for instance, or with other friends, where, they'll pick up on, let's say, a parent's stress and then try so hard to be good, to take care of that parent. And then sometimes it becomes so burdensome to them that it comes at the cost of them being able to take care of themselves or allowing somebody else to take care of them. And they can see the underneath meaning, which is often missed by other children. They pick up on social facades and disingenuousness or hypocrisy, and oftentimes they'll recognize the underlying motivations and dynamics. Oh, that's why you said that to me. They'll get it. They'll get why. So perceptiveness, right? They're intuitive, aware of even small changes in their environment. I have an adult patient who, has shared, actually many, but I'm thinking about one right now, who has shared that as a kid, he would pick up on things and say, I think this is what, I think this is what she's feeling, or they didn't like what they're saying, or they'll pick up on something, and then a lot of times what they would get is, oh, it's just in your head, or you're just being too sensitive. And then, like, time and time again, it'll pan out that that's the dynamic that was going on. And so you can imagine if what these kids are getting back a lot of times does not match up with what their perception is of something, that then they start to question themselves, and it can feel really like very conflicted on the inside because they are not getting feedback that their perspective is what it is, that it might be accurate, and then they feel really different, and then a lot of times they'll kind of hide it a lot. These kiddos also have a pretty strong moral conviction and global view. So they tend to be pretty idealistic. They're very passionate about fairness and truth, down to the level if you say, okay, give me just a minute. And they'll say, it's been 3 minutes. You said 1 minute. They're just so passionate about the rules of life and trying to make sense of things and making sure everything is fair. They can't tolerate hypocrisy and really cannot understand why other people can. Like I was seeing a preteen whose school, they were learning a lot about health, and yet their cafeteria was serving really, really bad, like food that was not that nutritious. And she couldn't understand why they were learning about this, but the school that they were learning it in was providing them very unhealthy food choices. And so, she had to write a letter to the school about this because it just seemed not right, and she didn't understand why everybody else was just saying, well, that's just how it goes. So they're also deeply committed to others and to then social and political concerns. Like, these are the kids who will really hurt if they see another child being bullied, for instance, in school. And then they're very compassionate toward humanity or to the well-being or safety of vulnerable populations. Okay, so animals, they're really, really connected with, protective of little children, sometimes of people who are older and maybe frail and they might need some extra help. These are the kids that end up really connecting with these vulnerable ones. So that's generally what I wanted to share about, so those characteristics are often found in gifted kids, but I do want to also bring up this topic of twice exceptionality, because not every gifted child has every one of those characteristics that I mentioned, although they do tend to kind of cluster together, those characteristics. Twice exceptional children are those that are intellectually gifted, but also have special needs or disabilities as well, okay? So these might be a specific learning disability, speech and language disorder, emotional or behavioral disorder, physical disability, and then like autism, attention, or, autism spectrum, ADHD, executive functioning difficulties, anxiety, depression, etc. So they're high in one area, but then they've got some other area where they're having a struggle. Okay, so they're very talented in one area, very knowledgeable, but what happens is sometimes their giftedness can overshadow, their giftedness can be overshadowed by their disability. So the disability might be so strong that even like to the point where sometimes I've known of individuals who've been put in special education program with children who are below average in their cognitive abilities overall, and then their giftedness or abilities are masked, like they're not even noticed or seen. Or on the other hand, they might be pretty clever and able to compensate, and so the disability doesn't get picked up on because they're working so hard and using their other abilities to be able to take care of this one area that might be a difficulty for them. And sometimes these needs are overlooked until they're adolescents and they can no longer compensate because the material is just too difficult, or sometimes they're just not even identified throughout their lives. So as you can imagine, these kids could have difficulties in school, and they can show inconsistent academic performance, frustration, giving up, feeling unmotivated. It can really chip away at their love of learning and curiosity, which is really sad to see because they usually really love to learn. There could be lower self-esteem and lowered self-efficacy. So again, they can start to feel like a fraud. Well, I'm not really that smart. It can lead to a lot of confusion for parents and teachers, who then might say, well, you're just being lazy. Like, why don't you want to do your math homework? You're just being lazy or oppositional, okay, when really there might be a need there. So it is important to keep in mind that there can be this twice exceptionality in children. Also, another area to think about is that these children have what we call asynchronous development. So it's an uneven development in their cognitive, emotional, and physical abilities, their skills, their talents. So they might be, there might be a mismatch, between one area of development versus another area of development. Or there might be also another way to look at asynchronous development is that they're mismatched from their peers. Okay, so they might be here whereas their peers are here in one area, and maybe in another area they're like this. So here we can see intellectually they might be really, really strong. Socially, then athleticism maybe, and then their fine motor skills might be really low. So they might seem oppositional in writing. Their writing concepts might be very strong, but they may not be able to physically, write. So they can seem like they're just maybe lazy or not wanting to try. What we find is that asynchrony is pervasive and often very noticeable in children. So here's intellectual capacity and here's emotional capacity, emotional maturity, okay? The higher the level of giftedness, the more the asynchronous development we find there to be. And some experts actually in the field actually look at asynchronous development as the defining factor rather than intellectual capacity. So the stronger the asynchronous development, they say, the more gifted the child is. And as you can imagine, this asynchronous development can add emotional charge to intensities that are already there. And it can create a psychic conflict in self-definition. And they know enough to be aware of what it is that they can't do. So this is something that a child drew. And I asked this child, where do you think you are meant, intellectually? And he kind of pointed to this area. And then I asked him, where did he think he was developmentally? And he said, here. So we started to talk about this feeling of asynchronous development. And he was very aware of those differences. So there's a lot of effects that come from asynchronous development. A lot of pressure, impossible self-expectations, powerlessness to not be able to be developmentally where one is intellectually. They can feel quite powerless, out of sync. Sometimes kids have described it as feeling like an alien, confusion and frustration by the child and others, and then giving up on oneself and ultimately asking, what's wrong with me? Another area I wanted to look at is overexcitabilities because it's so prevalent in gifted kids. Has anyone heard this word before, this term? No, okay. Overexcitabilities or OEs. And what that means is that that gifted children and adults feel higher than average neuronal sensitivity to sensory stimuli. And they demonstrate a uniquely heightened way of experiencing and responding to their environment. So you can imagine all life's experiences are going to be heightened. And sensitivity and intensity are found at all ends of the spectrum, from really high to really low. And there's 5 areas of overexcitability. There's intellectual, and we talked about that, right? The divergent thinking, convergent thinking, the need to understand and move toward problems. There's the emotional, the sensitivities, the perceptiveness, etc. The imaginational we talked about. The psychomotor. So these are kids who might need to move around a lot, who don't necessarily have ADHD, They just need to move because they've got so much energy in their bodies. Sometimes my office looks like a tornado went through it, just all the toys and everything around and the needing to, buzz around the room because there's so much of a excitability in that way. And then the sensual. So with the psychomotor, there also might be, like sometimes we see in adults, a need to always go on to the next project, needing to always be maybe stretching while you're watching TV or fiddling with something because it's just not enough. I've had people describe sometimes they're listening to music, but then they're like, oh, I wish I could listen to music. And they realize they're already listening to it, but they want more and more and more of whatever that stimulation is. And then the last one is sensual. Well, actually, the music fits right in with that. Sometimes touch, like a weighted blanket, can help with that. Sometimes taste, so there could be overeating because foods could taste so good. So these are pretty important. We do tend to see these in gifted kids. And so a relationship has actually been found between creativity and giftedness and overexcitabilities. So it's found in adults and children, and especially intellectual overexcitability, emotional, and imaginational. Those are pretty high for gifted kids and adults. I do want to just add that not every child has every single one of those overexcitabilities. They might have intellectual and imaginational, but not so much the sensual one. And also that there's an overlap, but not every gifted child has overexcitabilities, and not everyone who has overexcitabilities is intellectually gifted, but there does tend to be a correlation there. What is the impact of these overexcitabilities? People are overwhelmed by their children's intensities, and children often hear, you're too much, you're too much, you're too sensitive, you're too this, you're too that. So there can be isolation and conflict in families, at school, with peers. And then gifted children may have a crisis of self as they attempt to minimize their responses to better adapt and fit in with the vast statistical majority of people around them. Okay. So is it a blessing or a curse, really? This is something that these children and their parents often really struggle with. So these authors say that the highly intelligent individual has a remarkable capacity for seeing and internalizing vast uncertainties, possibilities, and problems. This gift can either be a catalyst for empowerment and self-actualization, or it can be a predictor of dysregulation and debilitation. So one or the other, or sometimes both. So one study, looked at national averages and then highly intelligent individuals, and found that the gifted individuals are really significantly at a greater risk for these disorders: mood, anxiety disorders, autism spectrum disorder, and ADHD. And interestingly, they were also found to be significantly higher at higher risk of developing conditions, that involve inflammation and dysregulation of the immune system. I often see this in kids. They always have a stuffy nose or allergies or asthma, and then also autoimmune diseases. At the same time, Dabrowski, who the gifted literature really, he's somebody who the gifted world really looks at a lot in terms of the things he's written about and has talked about. And he says that mental health is actually problematic, how we look at it. That generally we look at mental health as an absence of mental illness, as being adjusted to environment and societal norms, where there's constantly an inner balance or equilibrium, and the presence of well-being and life satisfaction. That's what we typically think about. And it focuses on reducing problematic symptoms. However, he said that it really reduces the opportunity or minimizes looking at developmental work that can happen. And so he talks about mental health as a process, not a state. And it involves the development of an individual personality through deep evaluation of one's values. So you can see now where some of the gifted population might fit this a little bit better than other conceptualizations of mental health. So he says pathological mental states like inner conflict or sadness or anxiety are actually necessary for growth. And he distinguishes between pathological and non-pathological. So pathological is when it's like you're just circulating with the same problem over and over again, and it's kind of stagnant, and there's no development forward, as opposed to the non-pathological. And, you know, he says prolonged, well, this is Micah talking about Dabrowski, saying prolonged periods or more permanent states of well-being and are characteristic for people with diminished sensitivity toward themselves and others, and to the existential realities of the human life in general. So you can imagine there is going to be disequilibrium if you're thinking about war or climate change or whatever it might be. And if those are the kinds of things these kids are thinking about, they're not always going to have this kind of sense of well-being and satisfaction. There's a lot to grapple with. Another area that's important to think about is entelechy. And gifted individuals tend to have an imperative towards self-determination and self-actualization. Okay? There's an intense desire and deep need to really be the most that they can be. So if they're putting together a project, they're going to, you know, make sure they get every detail on that right. If they're going to write a book, you can always get a little bit better. Whatever they're doing, a dance performance, they want to be really the best at what they could be. And it's not always just for outside praise. It's often just a sense of, I could keep growing. I want to keep growing and learning and being better at who I am. So it can be achievement-oriented, and there's also, like I said before, strong leadership qualities because of this. And people are often drawn, you know, to people who have entelechy and get inspired by them a lot. And I just want to say a little difference between entelechy versus like a problematic perfectionism is that this is a moving towards something, moving toward growth, moving towards something better, as opposed to the kind of perfectionism which is problematic, which is more like a moving away from a kind of an internal bully saying you're not good enough. You know, so one's about moving away from, and the other is moving toward growth. I want to go a little bit into treatment considerations and just start with this definition from the Columbus School definition of giftedness, because now that we've talked about all these different areas, it kind of puts them together. Giftedness is asynchronous development in which advanced cognitive abilities in heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different than the norm. This asynchrony increases with the higher the intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modifications in parenting, teaching, occupational therapy, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. So this definition kind of puts it all together. And as you can see, it's not just about being smart or about being high achieving. So if we think about treatment considerations, I kind of broke it up into certain areas. So sense of self, we want to help these kids really know who they are, understand, and accept their whole self. That means their strengths and also their imperfections and what they don't yet know. Also, to help them learn how to sustain their identity despite a lot of pressure to conform. So one of the biases is that everyone's going to appreciate gifted children and be like, oh, they're so special. But a lot of times some of these other characteristics that come with giftedness are not so appreciated because we live in a world that often wants, ultimately, people to be conventional and to follow a certain norm. So then, you know, these kids are grappling with, do I play into social facades and not really be authentic with who I am? Or, you know, do I risk being rejected by being my own person? So part of the work is really to figure out how to be authentic without alienating others. Another thing is to accept imperfections, limitations, and vulnerabilities. And part of that is just the limitation of being human and of being bound by space and time. So a lot of times there's a kind of a grief or a mourning that has to happen that they really can't do everything they want to do in their life, or even everything that they're good at doing. They're going to have to make some choices just because there are limits to time, and they are going to, have a finite time of life. And then also to learn how to set limits and to actually find time for rest, which is often the last thing on the agenda. And to listen to intuition, to their intuition and their unique creative voice. Another thing with a sense of self to address in treatment is to address the tricky defenses, because these kids can be pretty clever. There's a lot of intellectualization that can happen, a lot of rationalization. Well, I did this because, just always trying to kind of be protective of some sense of self, but oftentimes these defenses can actually get in their way. And even sublimation, which is always trying to grow and make something good out of something bad, in them. Sometimes that can also even be used as a defense, where it's like, I can't even touch my angry feelings. I'm always going to make them something positive. And then these other feelings that they have maybe are never really addressed. So these are things to be watchful for in therapy. And to help them really appreciate, the good things that could come from their giftedness. Like, they can really have an impact in changing one little part of the world, their little impact in the world. They're willing to stand up a lot of times for their own ideas, for what's fair and moral for themselves, but also for others. They're really, sensitive and caring and often protective of other people, and have a richness and depth of feelings and experiences. And I remember one child came in and was suicidal, and at the end said to me, I used to think that I would come here and just get rid of all those feelings. And now I realize that they're a part of me. This was like I don't remember now, maybe 9-year-old child, and said, these are just really a part of who I am. Like, now I could just say, this is me. And, he just kind of even put his arms up like this. It's like, I can accept all these different parts of me, even the things I didn't want and just wanted to get rid of. They're a part of who I am, and they're what makes me feel rich things inside of me that to give up the unpleasant feelings would mean I'd have to give up the pleasant ones too. And boy, would I hate to not love music as much as I do, or look at a beautiful painting and be moved in this way. So, okay, I'll accept the other end of this as well. Interpersonally, some of the things we want to look at in working with these kiddos is really realizing that because they're so sensitive and perceptive, they can feel burdened by others' expectations. So we can help them learn how to set clear boundaries and limits on what they can give and what's really their job to give. So kids, don't need to take on burdens of adults, for instance, So also helping them learn how to how to integrate being connected with somebody, but also separate and having their own separate needs. And the therapeutic relationship can really be used as a model. So we don't want to impose our needs, or when they're trying to take care of us, we can notice, and say, I wonder if in that moment you just were trying to take care of me, and really making that more a topic of conversation, in the sessions. So finding the balance between me and others. Also, we can facilitate social support. Some gifted kids, honestly, are not that interested. I mean, they might like to have a couple friends, but they're so much more interested in what's going on in their minds. And they don't really express a lot of distress about not having a lot of friends. Whereas others may be really socially awkward, but really want connections and not know how to get them. So we want to distinguish and not just impose our own ideas about what, how much social contact they need to be having. They really could be different from their peers and their interests. I mean, not every, peer is going to be interested in learning all about Bach's, music, for instance, but they might be. So it's a little hard to connect with other kids who might be talking about video games or, shopping, or I don't know, like other kinds of a TV show that they watched. So you could see there could be a mismatch. So we need to really help parents help their children find like-minded peers as well. Even if it's not in the same area of interest, if they can both be kind of equally passionate about different things, but maybe things that are kind of quirky or not things other kids are interested in, that might, develop into a really nice friendship. And they may also need a variety of friends. So this friend might fill kind of this need, and then this child might fill this need as a friend. So they might really need to have more than one, really good friend in order to meet some of their intensities that they have. Also, interpersonally, some of the work is to help them really empathize with others' needs, even if they don't seem relevant to them, or sometimes they might seem superficial to these kids, but to really understand that other people, also have their own needs, their own interests of value too, and to really empathize with that. And to understand what, impact their own giftedness has on others, that they might feel like too much to other people. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them, but just to understand that their intensities can be a little overwhelming for people. To help them reduce their unrealistic expectations of others, and really to come to terms with the fact that not everybody's going to experience the world like they do. So that, again, there could be some grief in that. And that can happen through the lifetime, actually, for adults too. And also to respect others' level of thinking, feeling, and intensities, and to really appreciate, even though there might be some shortcomings in their relationships, to really be able to identify what do their relationships offer them and what can they connect with, even if they can't connect in a whole bunch of areas. Okay, emotional treatment considerations. We want to increase the feeling vocabulary, so it's not just sad, mad. I mean, they have such nuanced feelings that we want to help these kids be able to have other words for these feelings so that their words can match a little closer to what they're actually experiencing. We also want to, the intensities can bring a lot of frustration tolerance, and so we want to improve that and help with self-regulation. Accept all their feelings and intensity. So even the difficult feelings are okay. Like that child that I said by the end of the therapy could say, I could accept these because to lose these would mean I would lose these too. So I can learn how to bear them. And then to grieve the loneliness of being different. And to help really these children develop the capacity to sit with the questions. Some of the questions that they have, they're not going to get answers to. So then all we can do is sit with the questions, especially when it comes to existential questions that not even adults can answer a lot of times, right? So really just being able to sit in it calmly without trying to, change their mind or fix something, but even just being able to hold it with them can be really, really helpful. And then coping, learning how to listen, because they can have a lot of ideas and can want to spew them out, but how do they also listen and then respond in a way that's going to be helpful to them too, if they want to create relationships? Anticipate and prepare for physical and emotional responses, and find intellectual, emotional, and physical outlets for their high levels of energy. So it might mean like they need to be on a bouncy ball, or they might need something in their hand while they're in school, or they might need to have an accommodation for a teacher to allow them to doodle. If they're still paying attention, some ways to take care of that. And then to really come to accept that their intensities are here to stay. Because I can tell you in working with gifted adults, these intensities don't go away. So instead they can learn how to think about them and regulate them, but they are going to be here to stay. Finding avenues to do something meaningful is so important. So I'm thinking about a child who took in a bird that was really was hurt. And so she and her family were taking care of this little bird. And then the mom, allowed this child an outlet by calling, I forget what it was, like a bird rescue association or something, and allowed this child to go take the bird over because, she was hurting so much that this bird was hurting. So the parent found an avenue for the child to take care of this in some way. And that's so important because it helps with that feeling of helplessness, if there's some way to take care of it. Cultivating relationships with role models who get them, and sometimes even just learning about other famous people who might have been gifted and just using them as guides can be important. I want to talk just a few moments about parents, because parents often feel really discounted, judged, mistreated, mistrusted by other people. And oftentimes will say to me that they get the question of, who do you think you are, kind of, or even the attitude of, you think your child is so special. And so they often feel really isolated, and then they question their own judgment and have to really also contend with the way society deals with their children. And it can be very painful, like if somebody doesn't understand a child's overexcitabilities, right? And then parents have to watch the responses that their child gets, and can be really painful for them. And they might hear things like, why is your child having all these problems if they're so smart? Well, they have asynchronous development, or they might be twice exceptional. Or why don't you discipline the way that I discipline? And a lot of times those ways of disciplining aren't going to be helpful for these kids. Parents also often find that they find that they identify, as they start to learn about their children and their giftedness and the characteristics, they start to sometimes have an aha moment of, oh, that was me, that is me too. And so then they really kind of have to come to terms with how they were treated, and the feelings that they had growing up, maybe as unidentified gifted children themselves. And so the trauma maybe that they've experienced around how other people dealt with their intensities could unconsciously affect how they are with their children. So they might see their children, they might think, well, am I damaged goods? And are my children damaged goods? If their children are struggling, parents might get really anxious because of how they were also treated. And then that anxiety can be imposed on the child. And then that makes things harder for the child too. So it's really important to deal with these issues and triggers that come up in parents, not just in children. So here's some ways parents can help their gifted child. They can support their needs to seek knowledge, understanding, and truth, regardless of their age. They may have to do it in an age-appropriate way, but for instance, they can look up a book about death that's appropriate for children, rather than saying you're too young to talk about this. Because if the kids are having these thoughts, they're going to look them up on the internet, or they're going to find out some other way. And then provide opportunities for the intellectual interests to be pursued. And like I said, with the bird example, find ways to address concerns, make an impact, and which will help them feel a little bit more self-efficacious. And even though gifted kids might need a little modified kind of parenting, they still need to have boundaries. And so the most important aspects of gifted children's development are actually their healthy parent-child and family relationships and strong parental support. So parents often have to become advocates. They really need to genuinely listen with curiosity. And what's probably one of the most important things for these kids is just to feel understood. So even if parents don't agree with the perspective, they need to be able to communicate, I understand what you're telling me, and it makes sense, some kind of sense. Okay. Just a couple more slides. I wanted to talk about therapists working with gifted kids, of course, becoming knowledgeable about the literature, and understanding that intellect might be the way in, and it's the one that these kids are going to use, but it's not enough. So it might be the way in. You might have to intellectually describe or explain something, but then you have to hold the feelings too, and help them learn how to bear and understand their feelings. Be willing to say, I don't know. That buys you a lot of currency. Or I don't know, but let's find out together. I might pull out my phone and we might look up something together if there's a question. And embrace the complexity of their thoughts and feelings, and be playful, be curious, be fluid, allow for different ways of not necessarily always talking about feelings, but playing and learning and discovering about the complexity of gifted children's world through imagination as well. Here's my little doggy being the perfect listening therapist right there. So be authentic, genuine, and trustworthy. Boy, do gifted kids have a strong radar for phoniness. Okay, so you really need to be authentic. Laugh if you need to. Don't just be open in that way with them. don't infantilize, like I said before, and don't overdiagnose or misdiagnose, especially overexcitabilities. So don't immediately go to ADHD or don't immediately go to depression. It might just be the intensities, the overexcitabilities that we're seeing. And so you'll have to really be careful to tease that apart and not just automatically diagnose with like a mental illness. And take seriously their concerns and their self-knowledge. So what they know about themselves, we don't want to discount that. We want to think about that and take it in too, so that they feel taken in. And here's a picture of a kid who drew like my hands holding all of my arms, holding all the intense, messy feelings that they were having. We really want to be mindful that kids, and gifted adults, they're sharing, maybe not with words, maybe through their play or their artwork, they're sharing intimate parts of themselves. And so we really want to be mindful about that and really be sensitive with how we receive this information. Because a lot of times it's information or parts of themselves that they really don't reveal to other people. Yeah. In terms of countertransference, I would suggest really identifying what your own biases are toward giftedness, toward whether you were identified as gifted or not identified as gifted and what that might mean in terms of your work with patients, and then also understanding patients' perspectives without taking them personally, because this is probably what they have felt by others or what they feel toward others, and it's a safe place to kind of explore that. And this is it right here, resources. There's a few resources. If you want to take a picture of this, I have one of a couple books as well. Any questions or thoughts?
It's just very impactful. I like how you focused a lot on characteristics, because I think that's something that we often lack when we think about giftedness. I actually had a question for you related to where you see the field going or what our role is related to biases that we do see, particularly with racial and ethnic minorities, which I think we know is more related to socioeconomic status and being to identify in children of color or those of low socioeconomic status, where you might not see typical characteristics.
Right.
I'm even thinking of a lot of my work is with undocumented families, and so defiance might not come up as much because they're afraid of authority, right? Or I could see this also being present with Black children, right? Yeah. And so I'm just thinking about how you make sense of that and where you see our field or our role in kind of bringing that more to the forefront, right? Versus going right away to this is a trauma response or this is, I don't know.
Boy, and I can think of a few patients that I have where that has always been the assumption, and as adults are able to say, this is not just my trauma, and now they have the words for it, right? It's like, no, some of this is truly how I came into the world. And then of course it might, giftedness is not separate from other life experiences. So even traumatic experiences or racism or whatever it is that somebody's experiencing is going to be experienced through this sensitive, perceptive, intense lens. So it's going to be felt that way, and they're really not separate. I'm thinking about an organization. It's called SANG. It was on the previous slide. And they are doing, outreach in different areas and different school districts to try to get information to a wider population and to school districts even that are underfunded. So that might, be something to look into. There's also some books, and if you contact me, I can give you some of the names of the books, but there are specific ones like being Black and gifted, for instance, or gifted in a minority, or gifted girls, where like they address more specifically how to identify and help these kids, because a lot of times it's not seen. But I really think a lot of times getting this information out to schools and to teachers of underserved children is really important, because they're a lot of times the eyes that can really say, okay, I'm wondering if this might be going on for this child. It might be the first person that might be able to identify, or at least wonder, with a parent, like maybe, this child needs to be tested to identify, are they really in that range? Yeah. Yeah, I know. There's so many other things that we didn't get to, like leadership and musical abilities, or there are a lot of ways, and that the cognitive test only measures certain aspects of giftedness. Yeah.
Hi, that was a lot of information, so thank you for that. My question also pertains to identification. I feel like because you've given us so much information, you've kind of listed also every possible behavior you could ever see in a child. So I'm particularly thinking about young kids.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't really know how much this is a categorical thing versus a continuous thing. But I feel like, if you just have smart young kids who have behaviors, most young kids are intense and have meltdowns or have some anxiety, or how do you tease apart whether they're just a typical child who's kind of on the smarter end, or a gifted child who really needs special identification and services?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it reminds me that, sometimes parents will say, my child's teacher said that they're gifted, and then they'll come in and maybe they'll score in the high average range, and they're smart kids, but they're not in the gifted range, and their behavioral difficulties are due to something else going on, right? So one thing I would say is for teachers to not, to be kind of cautious in how they word that to parents, like there's something that's going on and we're trying to identify what it is, and I'm going to suggest this is like a range of possibilities. Why don't we start with maybe getting a cognitive test? Maybe, that might be a way to start, rather than, making that assumption. I think the best way probably in identifying is for people who have a wide range of examples with kids, because then they can kind of see what's normative and what isn't. You're absolutely right, especially for younger kids. I mean, they're going to be bouncy, and they're going to have a lot of energy, and they're going to have sometimes temper tantrums, and they're not necessarily related to giftedness. They're just life or development or whatever it might be. But when there is a wide, if once there is a wide range of examples one has with kids, and then they're seeing some kind of higher level thinking about, or rationales about things that the kids are saying, that might be a way, to start to wonder, is that what's going on with this child? Are you in teaching, or are you?
I'm a psychologist.
You're a psychologist. Okay.
I guess just sort of to add to that, talking about the continuous versus categorical, and I guess what makes me a little uncomfortable is like an IQ score is a number. So like, let's say we have a kid that, we think maybe is gifted, and they're having a lot of these behaviors, and they get a 128
right
on the, is that like, right?
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
I
Like,
do. I absolutely do. It is continuous.
Yeah.
I mean, it is continuous. And we also look at confidence intervals. So a score might be 128, like you said, but we could look at a confidence interval score and say, okay, we're 95% sure that given error, or the given day, or maybe the level of motivation that day, or maybe the child's not at their best, but we're pretty sure that their range is between, their true score is going to be between, I don't know, I'm making up the numbers now, but like 123 to 134. Okay, well, so the upper end of that, maybe on a better day, they might have scored in the more of what we officially think of as a gifted range. I think it is important, to get testing done from somebody who's not just going to look at just like, well, this is the IQ score, and that's that, like one number, and that's all we're looking at. We're looking at a constellation of things. We're looking at the more nuanced interpretations in a cognitive test, but also at other like clinical data, maybe leadership qualities or other areas of talent. So we'd want to look at all of that together.
Sorry, I promise this will be my last question. Would you recommend, I'm just saying that, when I test for other things, I do the same thing. When I do evaluations, I would never use just one test, right?
Yeah,
It's like a
right.
whole, evaluation, a constellation. So would you say there's like a top 2 or 3 things that you would look at in addition to the cognitive IQ score? Like what else, like what's sort of complementary to that?
I would look at clinical data, my own experience with the child. I want to also look at their achievement scores, and there are different kinds of scales that parents can fill out. There's a good book, this one, Misdiagnosis and Dual Diagnosis of Gifted Children and Adults, that help differentiate some of those behaviors. Like, for instance, this might be Asperger's and this might be giftedness, and here's how to differentiate between the two. They do it like with a lot of different diagnoses, so that's another way to start to differentiate. That's a really good book to get if you're interested in the kinds of things you're asking questions about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. We hope you can join for the next STAR seminar on November 20th. Allison Zalta will be presenting on a CBT resilience intervention for adults who've experienced childhood interpersonal trauma.